The night sky over the Pacific was clear and silent. When the first signal came, it was not a message anyone could understand. At first, it was a sound like a low hum that rolled through the upper atmosphere and faded into the oceans. The scientists at the Pacific Observation Station were the first to notice it. They thought it was interference from a satellite or maybe a test from another nation, but soon every radar and telescope on Earth picked it up. The signal was not from Earth. It was from deep space. In a command center in Colorado, a woman named Karen Doyle watched the data stream across her screen. She was the director of the Deep Space Defense Program, and she had seen strange things before, but nothing like this. She called for the analysts and the linguists to look at it. They said it was too structured to be natural and too perfect to be random. It was a message. Across the world, governments met in secret rooms. The message repeated every hour, growing clearer, as if whoever sent it wanted to make sure they were heard. Then one night a shape appeared in orbit. It was large and silver and moved without sound. It did not match any human design. The world held its breath. People watched from rooftops and deserts, and frozen fields, waiting for the first contact that humans had dreamed about for centuries. Karen stood with her team in the control room when the translation came. The message was simple and cold. It said, "We claim your world as ours. Surrender peacefully. Resistance will not be tolerated." There was silence in the room. She looked at the faces of her people and saw fear and disbelief, but also something else, anger. The alien ship did not wait long. It sent smaller crafts that entered the atmosphere like falling stars. They hovered over major cities, New York, Los Angeles, Beijing, London. The crafts released energy waves that shut down power grids and communication networks. The world went dark in hours. Military forces tried to respond, but the weapons did little. The invaders used shields that absorbed every missile and laser strike. The first day was chaos. The second was terror. In the ruins of Washington, a group of soldiers led by Captain Eric Lawson moved through the streets carrying supplies and trying to reach survivors. He had served in wars before, but nothing like this. He had seen drones cut through tanks like paper. He saw his men vanish under beams of light that melted the ground. Yet he kept moving because he had orders to find anyone who could help the resistance. Karen was moved to an underground bunker. She coordinated what was left of Earth's defense network. Her team used old satellites and coded radio messages to stay in touch with the few bases still standing. Q talked with Eric through a weak signal. He told her what he saw, and she told him where to go to gather people she knew. Humanity had only one chance to fight back, and that chance would not come from weapons, but from what humans were willing to become. The aliens called themselves the Tarak. They were a race of conquerors who had taken dozens of worlds they believed humans were weak and divided, easy to break. They sent messages across the occupied cities telling people to obey or be erased. Some humans did obey, but most did not. They hid in forests and deserts and mountains. They built small camps where they shared food and stories. They learned how to live without machines and power. They became ghosts in their own land. Eric found one such camp in the mountains of Wyoming there. He met a young engineer named Laura Benton. She had been working on experimental energy cells before the invasion. Now she used her knowledge to build simple weapons and shields. She told Eric that the Tarak technology could be disrupted if they found the right frequency. She believed the alien shields used sound waves that could be reversed. Eric brought her to the command bunker, where Karen listened carefully to her plan. It was risky and untested, but it was something. Days turned into weeks. The Tarak built towers across the continents, tall black spires that glowed blue at night. They said the towers were to reshape the air and water for their kind. Soon the Earth would not be livable for humans. Karen looked at the satellite images and knew time was running out. She ordered every resistance cell to attack the towers to slow the process, even if it meant death. She knew that every hour they delayed gave Laura more time to finish her device. The first human counterattack was in Europe. Thousands of fighters stormed a tower in Germany. They used old tanks and aircraft from museums, anything that could move and shoot. They were outmatched. But they fought hard. The Tarak soldiers moved with perfect precision, but they were surprised by how fiercely humans fought. One alien commander recorded that humans screamed even when they were dying. They threw rocks when their guns failed. They bit and clawed. Even when burned, they kept. Moving, Karen received the reports she read about villages destroyed and families gone. But she also saw that one tower had fallen. It was the first time in history that the Turok had lost a structure to a species they considered primitive. That small victory sent a spark across the world. People began to believe that maybe they could fight back. Maybe humans were not as weak as the invaders thought. Laura worked night and day. She used scrap metal and broken circuits. She tested the device. Using old alien fragments, she found the frequency, and when she turned it on for the first time, a nearby alien drone lost control and crashed into the bunker wall. Everyone cheered, but Karen told them to stay quiet. They could not let the aliens know yet. Eric gathered his unit again. They would carry the prototype to the field test site near Chicago. The city was in ruins, but there was still a small resistance group there. He moved at night, hiding under debris and tunnels. The Turok patrols searched the streets with bright white light. He felt the heat of their engines above him, but he kept going. Laura walked beside him, carrying the small device in her backpack. She said, if this worked, they could send the signal across the planet. When they reached the city, they saw what was left of it. Buildings burned, cars melted, but there were still people hiding in basements and subway tunnels. When they heard Eric's voice, they came out. They were tired and hungry, but their eyes still held fire. Laura placed the device on a metal table and began to adjust the settings. She said it would need a power source larger than any battery they had. Eric looked at the skyline and said they could use the remains of a Turok generator nearby, if they could capture it. The group moved fast through the ruins. They found the generator guarded by 3 alien soldiers. They were tall and armored in silver plates, their faces hidden behind glowing masks. The humans attacked using rifles and homemade explosives. The battle was quick and brutal, one by one. The aliens fell when the last one fell to the ground. The humans stared at its face through the broken mask. It looked almost calm, like it had never believed it could. Laura connected the generator and the device began to hum. The sound was deep and strange. It grew louder until everyone covered their ears. Then suddenly it stopped for a moment. There was silence. Then every alien drone in the sky above Chicago froze the lights on. Their ships flickered and went dark. Eric looked up and whispered that it worked, but in that same moment the generator exploded. The blast threw them to the ground. When the smoke cleared, Laura was gone and the device was broken in half. Eric called Karen through the radio and told her what happened. She listened without speaking. She knew what this meant. The device worked for a moment, and that was enough to prove they could fight back. She looked at the map on her screen. Red marks covered most of the planet, but she smiled for the first time in months because she knew something the Turok would soon learn. Humans do not surrender, and they do not forget. The smoke over Chicago still hung in the air like a ghost of the battle that had passed. The streets were filled with ash and twisted metal. Eric stood among the ruins looking at the broken device that Laura had built. He could still smell the burning wires and melted steel. He felt the loss of her deeply. She had been the only one who believed from the start that humans could beat the Turok with more than bullets. He looked at the sky where the alien drones had fallen silent for those few seconds, and he remembered the sound of silence that followed. It had been the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He picked up the shattered pieces of the device and put them in his bag. He promised to Karen over the radio that he would bring them back. Karen sat in the underground bunker surrounded by maps and flickering monitors. She listened to reports from different parts of the world. Some were full of despair, but others spoke of new courage in Africa. Fighters had taken down a supply ship in South America. Rebels had managed to destroy one of the smaller towers. The resistance was no longer hiding. It was growing and learning and adapting. She knew this was how humans survived. They never stayed down for long. She sent out new, coded messages across the shortwave channels telling everyone to keep fighting and to keep believing. The Turok were not used to this kind of war. They had always crushed worlds quickly. They believed fear and fire would make species surrender. But humans were different even when cities burned. They did not stop even when they had nothing left. They kept coming back. The alien commanders grew restless. They began to deploy larger ships and heavier weapons to destroy the last human strongholds. Their leader, called Prime Commander Zirath, ordered that the Earth be purified within 6 months. He wanted the planet ready for Turok colonization. He did not understand why humans were still resisting. After such losses, he saw them as stubborn animals who did not understand the scale of their defeat. Eric and his team moved out of Chicago under the cover of night. They traveled through old train tunnels to avoid the patrols. The group was smaller now, but more determined than ever. Among them was a medic named Nora Fields. She had been a nurse before the war, and she treated every wound with quiet care. She had lost her husband in the first week of the invasion, but she never spoke of it. She only said that every life she saved was a way of fighting back. She worked beside Eric, fixing what little they had and making sure everyone stayed alive. They reached a hidden airstrip in the countryside where a few engineers had repaired an old cargo plane. It barely flew, but it was enough to carry them to the next safe zone. Karen had told them to head toward the Rocky Mountains, where a larger group was building something big. She did not say what it was, only that it could change everything. Eric looked at the horizon as the plane rose into the air. He saw fires below where alien ships moved like shadows across the land. He felt fear but also pride because humans were still there fighting. Karen watched from the command center as new patterns appeared on her radar. The aliens were focusing on North America. They wanted to crush the largest resistance first. She sent urgent messages to every cell telling them to scatter and hide. She knew they could not face a direct assault, yet she needed time for what was being built. In the mountains, it was something even she did not fully understand. It was being led by an old scientist named Dr. Henry Brooks, who had once worked on deep energy research before the war. He had gone missing for months, and when he returned, he brought plans for something he called the Resonance Core. He said it could turn the enemy's own technology against them, if completed in the mountains. Eric's plane landed near a hidden valley where hundreds of people were working. They had built a small base with solar panels and makeshift shelters. Smoke rose from workshops where machines were being repaired. Henry Brooks stood near the center, surrounded by blueprints and tools. He was an older man with calm eyes that hid his exhaustion. He welcomed Eric and Nora and thanked them for bringing the remains of Laura's device. He said her design was the key to what they were trying to build. The resonance core used the same frequency principle, but on a massive scale, it could send a pulse across the atmosphere strong enough to disrupt every alien machine on Earth, but they needed more power. The team worked day and night scavenging parts from crashed alien ships and broken satellites. They melted metal and rewired circuits. Everyone had a job. Some cooked, some guarded the perimeter. Others built machines from nothing. Eric became the head of defense. He trained young volunteers to fight and to protect the valley. He knew the track would eventually find them, but until then, they would be ready. Nora worked with the medics, treating burns and injuries from the work sites. She often looked up at the sky at night, where alien ships drifted like dark moons, and she whispered that humans would outlast them. Meanwhile, in orbit, Commander Sirath studied the reports. His analysts told him that the humans had become unpredictable. They did not follow patterns. They did not retreat when logic said they should. He found this frustrating. He ordered new scanning drones to locate any unusual energy readings and destroy them. He also sent psychological broadcasts into the radio waves, repeating messages of surrender. He told humans that resistance was hopeless, that they were facing extinction. But instead of breaking them, his messages made them angrier and more united. Karen continued to coordinate through broken lines of communication. She knew her people were tired. She was tired too. But she could not stop. She thought about Laura and all the others who had died, and she promised herself that if there was even one chance to win, she would take it. She told Henry that once the core was ready, she would find a way to send the signal across the world using the old defense satellites. Henry agreed, but said they would need one more piece of power source strong enough to keep the pulse stable. The only source that could work was on a captured alien ship stationed near Nevada. Eric volunteered to lead the mission to get it. He gathered a small team, including Nora. They traveled for days across empty lands full of wrecks and burned fields. They saw no birds, no animals, only the sound of the wind. They moved at night and rested during the day, hiding from alien patrols. When they reached the desert, they saw the alien ship. Half buried in sand, it was guarded by drones and a few Tarak soldiers. They spent hours watching the patrol patterns until they found a way in. They attacked at dawn, moving fast and silent. Eric used a stolen alien rifle that fired bursts of light. While Nora carried a small jammer to block their scanners, the fight was short but fierce. The air was filled with dust and heat when it was over. They had the power core. It was a glowing sphere that pulsed like a heartbeat. They carried it carefully, threw the sand back to their truck and drove without stopping until they reached the mountains again. When Henry saw the core, he said it was perfect and that now they could finish the resonance. Karen sent out a message to all surviving groups, telling them to prepare for something big. She said the day would come soon when every human would stand together for one last fight. She said this was not just about survival, but about showing the universe who humans really were. She did not know if the message would reach everyone, but she hoped it would travel through the broken airwaves and into every heart that still beat on Earth. The following days, the Turok intensified their search. They began to burn forests and drain rivers. They wanted to smoke out the resistance. They did not know that deep in the mountains the humans were building their answer. Henry and his team connected the power core to the resonance chamber. Wires ran through the ground, humming softly at night. Eric stood guard outside watching the stars. He thought about how small humans were compared to the vastness of space, but also how strong they had become. He knew they were about to do something the aliens would never expect. The night before the test, Karen arrived at the mountain base. She had traveled by convoy through enemy lines, risking everything to see it herself. When she walked into the chamber, she saw the glowing machine and the faces of the people who built it. She felt something she had not felt since before the war. Hope. Henry told her they would test it at dawn. If it worked, the signal would spread through the air and disable the alien systems for a short time, enough for humans to strike back. If it failed, the explosion would destroy the entire valley. She nodded and said it was worth it. As the first light of morning touched the peaks, everyone gathered around the machine. The air was cold and still. Henry placed his hand on the control switch and looked at Karen. She gave a small nod. He pulled the lever. The sound that followed was unlike anything they had ever heard. It was deep and endless, like the earth itself was breathing. The ground shook, lights flickered, and then the sky turned white. Every alien machine within miles began to fall from the air and crash into the mountains. And in that blinding light, the humans saw what it meant to fight, not because they could win easily, but because they refused to ever stop. The white light faded slowly, leaving the valley covered in smoke and silence. Karen opened her eyes and saw that the ground around her was cracked and blackened, but she was alive. She heard voices calling out through the haze, people shouting names, and coughing from the dust. Eric ran toward the machine that had once glowed like a small sun. It was now broken in half, but still humming faintly. He shouted for Dr. Henry Brooks, who lay near the edge of the platform. Henry was breathing weakly, his hands burned, but his eyes were open. He whispered that it had worked. Across the sky, hundreds of alien ships were falling, their engines dead and their lights gone. The mountains shook as the wrecks crashed into the ground one after another. The humans stood watching with disbelief and joy. They had done what no other world had done. They had turned the power of the Turok against them. For a few hours, the world was theirs again. Radio channels came alive with voices from across the continents, people cheering and crying and shouting that the aliens were falling. It was the sound of hope spreading through a broken world. Karen looked at the machine and then at Henry. She asked how long it would last. He said not long. Maybe a few hours before, the Turok found a way to restart their systems. He told her they had to use this time to strike to take back as much ground as they could before the enemy recovered. Eric heard this and began gathering his team. He called every resistance group, still in range, telling them this was the moment to rise. The world needed to move now. In New York, a group of fighters came out from the tunnels they had been hiding in for months. They saw the alien patrols frozen in place, their ships grounded, and their weapons silent. They moved fast, reclaiming streets that had been lost in the first week of the invasion in Paris. Old soldiers and young students climbed the remains of the Eiffel Tower and raised a torn flag, while in Tokyo survivors used construction machines to destroy the alien towers. Humans everywhere began to move together like a single heartbeat. Back in the valley, Karen organized new communication lines. She sent instructions to coordinate attacks. She told everyone that they were not just surviving, now they were fighting to win. She spoke through an old transmitter, her voice tired but strong. She said the aliens thought humans were weak. They thought fear would break them, but they were wrong. She said that humanity had lived through wars, hunger, and fire, and still they stood. She ended by saying that every person alive now was a soldier, even if they held no weapon. Eric led his unit down the mountain toward a nearby alien base that had fallen silent during the pulse. They moved through forests where alien machines lay half buried in dirt, their silver bodies cracked and sparking. He could feel the heat from their engines cooling. He told his men to stay sharp, because he knew the enemy would not stay down. Forever. When they reached the base, they found dozens of captured humans trapped inside energy cages. Nora worked fast to disable the locks using one of the broken alien panels. Soon the cages flickered and vanished. The freed people looked weak, but their eyes were full of fire. Among the prisoners was a young pilot named Alex Carter. He said he had been captured during one of the first air battles and forced to watch as his friends were killed. He offered to help Eric guide the freed people back to the valley. He said he knew how to fly an alien scout ship because he had studied their systems while in captivity. Eric agreed, and together they repaired one of the small crafts that had crashed near the base. They stripped out tracking devices and learned how to start its engine. It roared to life with a strange blue flame, and for the first time a human flew an alien ship in orbit. Commander Zirath was furious. He watched from his command vessel as reports came in of massive system failures. His fleet was blind and deaf. He ordered his technicians to restore control. They worked frantically, rerouting power and recharging their cores. He could not understand how humans had done this. It was impossible for a primitive species to manipulate Tarak technology. He sent orders to every surviving ship to locate the source of the pulse and destroy it. Once systems came back online, Henry lay in the medical tent surrounded by the wounded. Nora tended to his burns. He told her that the machine could be rebuilt stronger next time. He said he had taken notes and saved the data cores before the explosion. She asked him if he could do it again. He smiled weakly and said, not him, but someone else would, because that was what humans did. They learned even from their pain. They always found a way forward. Karen visited him and promised to keep the project alive. He told her to remember that victory would not come from power alone, but from unity. The hours passed, and the alien systems began to flicker back to life. Radar stations picked up movement in orbit. The ships were recovering. Karen knew they had little time left. She sent new orders to Eric, telling him to pull back to the valley before the counterattack began. He refused, saying they could not waste the chance they had. He wanted to hit one more base near Denver, where a large alien control tower still stood. He believed if they destroyed it, they could slow the recovery across the region. Karen hesitated, but she trusted him. She told him to go and wished him luck. Eric's team approached the tower at dusk. It rose high above the ground, glowing faintly with blue light. The power inside was unstable from the earlier pulse. He told his team they would plant charges at the base supports and bring it down. Alex flew overhead in the captured ship, providing cover. Nora stayed close, helping set the explosives. They moved quickly, but the aliens were already returning. Patrols began to appear at the edges of the ruins, their lights cutting through the smoke. Eric shouted for his team to finish the job as laser fire lit up the night. The ground shook as the first charge went off. The tower began to lean its top, glowing brighter with each second. Eric yelled for everyone to fall back. Nora stumbled and he grabbed her, pulling her behind a collapsed wall. The tower fell moments later, crashing down with a sound like thunderdust covered the air, and pieces of alien metal rained down. When the noise faded, the tower was gone and the alien lights went dark again. They had done it, but their victory came with a price. The alien reinforcements arrived moments later, heavy transports descending from the clouds. They opened fire without warning. Alex tried to lift the ship, but it was hit and went spinning into the distance. Eric shouted for his men to scatter. He and Nora ran through the burning ruins, chased by drones. They barely made it out alive when they finally stopped miles away. Both were bleeding and exhausted, but they smiled because they knew they had taken another piece of the planet back. Karen received word of the explosion and felt both pride and fear. She knew the retaliation would be brutal. She began to move the main command center deeper underground. She told everyone to prepare for a long fight because the Tarak would come with everything they had. She watched the sky through a cracked window as the stars seemed to move. She realized those were not stars, but enemy ships re-entering the atmosphere. She whispered that this was only the beginning. In orbit, Commander Zirath stared at the planet, his rage cold and controlled. He told his officers that humans were dangerous beyond reason. He said they were not to be underestimated again. He ordered the creation of a cleansing wave, a weapon designed to wipe out all organic life on the surface. Within a week it would be ready. He promised his people that Earth would burn in the valley Karen called for. Every scientist and engineer, she said, they had to prepare the next version of the resonance before the weapon was deployed. Henry, too weak to stand, gave them his notes and told them where to begin. Nora returned with Eric and brought new alien, parts they had salvaged from the battle. She said Laura's original design had survived in fragments and could still guide them. They all worked together under the dim light of torches. The nights grew colder, but no one stopped as the days passed. Strange signals filled the air. The aliens were building something vast in orbit. People could see a new glow in the sky at night like a second moon. The Resistance knew it was the weapon that would end them. Yet no one ran. They dug deeper, fortified their shelters, and kept building their machine. Eric walked through the camp, watching families cooking small meals. Sharing what little they had, he realized that this was what made humans different. They cared for each other. Even in the face of death, Karen stayed awake for days, coordinating every detail. She spoke with leaders from faraway places who still fought in small pockets. She promised them that a final stand was coming, that they would fight not for land or survival, but for the right to exist. She ended every message the same way. She said they declared war on Earth, but they had no idea who we really are. The sky began to glow brighter every night as the alien weapon neared completion, and deep underground, the humans prepared to remind the universe that Earth was not a place that surrendered, it was a species that endured. The days turned darker as the glow in the sky grew larger every night. The people could see it moving slowly above the clouds like a red wound spreading across the heavens. They knew it was the alien weapon, the cleansing wave that Commander Zirath had promised. It was said to erase every living thing on Earth in one single burst of light. Karen stood on the ridge above the valley and watched it with tired eyes. She could feel the fear in her chest, but she refused to let it show behind her. The valley was alive with movement. Men and women worked without rest, building the second resonance core, the machine that they believed could stop the weapon before it fired. Dr. Henry Brooks lay in a tent nearby his body, weak and thin, but his mind still sharp. He gave directions to the young engineers who carried his notebooks and followed his voice. He told them that the second core must be stronger than before. It needed to hold the pulse longer and reach beyond the atmosphere. He said it must not only disable the enemy's systems, but turn their weapon back against them. Karen listened and nodded. She told him that humans would not just survive this time. They would make the invaders remember their mistake. Eric led his team on constant patrol around the valley. He knew the aliens were watching and waiting. He had seen the sky full of drones again, though fewer than before. He told his fighters to stay hidden and keep their weapons ready. They had learned from the last attacks, and now they used old camouflage nets and heat shields made from scrap metal. Nora worked beside him, repairing rifles and armor. She had a bandage on her arm from the last mission, but she kept moving, saying that pain meant she was still alive. They both knew the next days would decide everything. In orbit, Commander Zirath watched the planet through the glass of his command deck. He saw the fires and smoke of human resistance still burning, and it filled him with a cold rage he had never faced. A species that refused to die, he ordered his scientists to accelerate the weapon's charge. They warned that firing it too early could damage their own fleet. But he did not care. He wanted the planet gone before it could fight back again. He believed humans were a disease that must be erased. Karen gathered her key people in the bunker that night. The air smelled of oil and metal. She told them the truth, that they might not survive the next attack, but if they succeeded, Earth would live. She said that the second resonance core would need to be placed high in the mountains to reach the orbit field. It would require a carrier large enough to lift it into the upper atmosphere. Alex Carter, who had repaired the alien ship, stood up and said he could fly it. He said he had spent nights learning every part of the alien craft and believed he could control it even through the energy storm. Eric volunteered to go with him to protect the device. Karen tried to stop him, but he said if this was The last mission he wanted to be there. The valley prepared for launch. They worked through freezing wind and falling ash. The red light from the sky cast long shadows across the ground. The sound of hammers and engines filled the air. Everyone moved. With purpose, children carried water. Women packed food. Men hauled metal plates and wires together. They became a single machine driven by one will. Henry directed the final assembly from his bed, his voice faint over the radio. He said that once the core reached the right altitude, Karen would send the activation code from the command station. The pulse would spread through the atmosphere and overload the alien weapon before it could fire. Nora stood by the launch ramp, helping load the resonance core into the ship. She touched Eric's arm and told him to come back alive. He smiled and said he would try, though they both knew it was a promise no one could keep. Alex sat in the pilot seat, checking the controls, his face calm but his hands shaking slightly when the engine started. The valley shook with their roar. The ground team stepped back, covering their faces from the heat. Karen stood watching as the ship lifted slowly into the night sky, its lights cutting through the smoke. She whispered a quiet prayer for them as the ship climbed higher. The red glow above became brighter. It was the alien weapon opening its vast energy wings across space. Commander Zirath stood before his officers and ordered the countdown, his voice cold and certain. He said the humans would be nothing but dust within the hour. His technicians began the sequence, the weapon core gathering power like a sun ready to burn. Meanwhile, Alex pushed the alien craft to its limit. The controls fought him, but he refused to slow down. Eric held the resonance core steady in the cargo bay as it hummed with energy, the lights flickering across its surface back on the ground. Karen and her team tracked the ship's progress on their small screens. The signal was weak but still alive. Henry whispered that it was almost ready. He coughed hard and said they must send the activation signal exactly when the ship reached the upper layer of the atmosphere, or it would fail. Karen counted the seconds in her head, each one feeling like a lifetime. Nora watched from the ridge, tears on her face as the red light from space grew brighter. Inside the alien ship, Alex shouted that the controls were failing. The energy storm from the weapon was distorting everything. Eric fought to hold the core steady. He could feel the heat rising through the hull. He told Alex to keep climbing no matter what. Suddenly, the radio crackled with Karen's voice telling them it was time. Eric looked at the device, then at Alex. He said to tell everyone on the ground that they were not fighting alone. Alex nodded and pressed the final lever. The ship shot upward into the sky. At that same moment, Karen entered the code into the transmitter. Henry's hand rested on hers, guiding the final numbers. She pressed the key and sent the signal. A beam of light invisible to the human eye raced through the clouds and connected with the ship. The resonance core activated with a sound like thunder that rolled across the entire planet. In orbit, the alien weapon froze, its energy field rippling as if struck by lightning. The Tirak technicians shouted that their systems were collapsing. Commander Zirath demanded to know what was happening, but before anyone could answer, the weapon exploded in a burst of white fire. From the ground, people saw the sky ignite. The red glow vanished, replaced by a storm of light that spread across the heavens. The sound came seconds later, shaking the earth. Windows shattered and mountains trembled. Karen fell to her knees, watching as the explosion tore through the alien fleet, hundreds of ships burning and falling like meteors. The sky rained fire for hours. The night turned bright as day, and every person who saw it knew that something greater than fear had just been born. Eric and Alex never returned. The last transmission from the ship had been a single word: freedom. The valley was silent as people watched the burning sky. Nora cried quietly, holding Eric's helmet in her hands. Karen stood beside her, unable to speak. She felt both grief and pride because she knew their sacrifice had saved the world. Henry smiled faintly before closing his eyes for the last time. He whispered that this was what it meant to be human. When the fires faded, the alien fleet was gone. Their command ships destroyed and their weapon turned to dust, but fragments of smaller vessels still orbited the planet, some still alive and trying to regroup. Karen ordered every surviving force to hunt them down. She said they had to make sure the enemy never returned. She told her people that Earth would not be rebuilt by fear but by strength. She looked around at the faces of the men and women who had given everything and said they would build again. But This time they would build for all humanity. In the weeks that followed, the smoke cleared and the sun shone again over the ruined cities. People came out from the underground shelters. They planted small gardens in the cracked soil. They rebuilt homes from rubble and shared food with strangers. Karen moved among them, helping wherever she could. She no longer wore her uniform. She said the war had ended, but the fight to live had just begun. Above the planet, the last fragments of the alien fleet drifted silently. One damaged cruiser still moved, its lights flickering deep inside its commander. Cyrath lay wounded, surrounded by broken machines. He looked at the blue world below and realized his greatest mistake. He had thought humans were fragile, but they were made of something his kind could never understand. He whispered that they were monsters in their own way, creatures of fire who would rather die than kneel. His last thought before the darkness took him was that no one had warned them what humans really were. Back on Earth, Karen stood with Nora on the mountain ridge. They watched the sunrise. The sky was clean for the first time in months. The light touched the broken towers and the quiet valleys below. Karen said softly that the war was over, but the story of what humans did here would never be forgotten. She said someday someone out there would hear of Earth again, and they would remember the world that fought back. Nora nodded and said that when they come again, we will be ready. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the sound of hammers and voices, life beginning again after the storm. The planet was scarred but alive, and for the first time in a long time, the people of Earth looked at the sky not with fear, but with pride, because they had proved what no one in the galaxy had believed, that humanity was not a myth or a weak species. They were survivors born of fire and loss and courage. And when the universe had tried to break them, they had stood unbroken. The smoke still hung over the ruined alien capital, and the burned fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and the wind carried the smell of fire and metal and the sound of machines moving through the dust as the humans advanced slowly across the broken ground, with their armor blackened and their faces tired, but still filled with something hard that refused to stop, because they had come too far to turn back now, and because they were fighting not just for survival but for the memory of every human who had fallen when the invaders had come to Earth without warning and burned the cities and thought they could make humans kneel, but instead they had made them rise. Ethan walked ahead of the squad, and his rifle was low but ready, and the dust stuck to his skin, and his heart beat heavy but steady as he looked toward the distant horizon, where the alien palace still burned like a red wound against the pale sky. And he thought of home and of the people who would never see this victory, but who had made it possible with their courage and their anger and their stubborn will, that had made the enemy understand what it meant to fight a human. Lara walked beside him, and her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and she had lost her helmet hours ago. But she did not care, because she could finally breathe free air, even if it smelled of ash. And she looked at Ethan and said in a tired voice that it was finally over and that maybe now they could rest. But Ethan shook his head and said quietly that it would never really be over, because there would always be another threat, another enemy, another sky to defend, because that was what being human meant. Behind them, the rest of the unit moved in silence, and their boots made soft crunching sounds on the dead ground. And above them, the Earth ships still hovered like dark stars in the pale sky, their engines humming low as they scanned for signs of resistance. But there was none left now, because the alien fleets had been broken and their worlds burned and their leaders captured or dead, and the war that had begun with arrogance had ended with silence, and the universe would remember the day they had declared war on Earth. The humans had been underestimated and mocked and called a primitive species, and the aliens had seen only the fragile bodies and the small planet, and they had thought it would be easy, but they had not understood the fire that lived inside human hearts, and they had not known that once humanity was united under one cause, nothing could stop them, because they had learned pain and fear and loss since the first days of their history, and they had survived everything the universe could throw at them long before they reached the stars. As the day faded, Ethan and Lara reached the edge of the alien city, and there they found the last remaining stronghold, a half-destroyed fortress built of silver and glass, and inside it they found the alien commander, the same one whose voice had declared the invasion years ago across the skies of Earth, his body broken and his pride gone. And when he saw the humans, he tried to speak, but his voice was weak and filled with disbelief. and he asked why they had fought so hard, why they had not just surrendered like so many others had done before them. Ethan looked at him and said simply that humans did not know how to surrender, because it was not in their blood, and because they were built from struggle and from the will to keep going, even when the universe tried to crush them. And he said that maybe the aliens would have understood if they had studied not the machines or the weapons, but the hearts of humans, because that was where their true power came from. The alien looked up with fading eyes and said that they had thought humans were soft creatures of comfort and emotion. And Ethan smiled a little and said that they were right about the emotion but wrong about what it meant, because it was that emotion that made them dangerous. It was love and hate and fear and hope all mixed together, and it burned hotter than any weapon. And once unleashed, it could never be stopped. When the alien finally went still, Ethan stood in silence for a long time, and then he turned and walked out into the open where the wind blew stronger now, carrying away the last smoke from the city. And he could see the horizon stretching endlessly ahead, and for the first time he thought maybe there could be peace, even if it was only for a little while. The humans began to rebuild the outposts and send messages back to Earth, and soon the voice of home came through the static-filled channels, and it sounded like music to the soldiers who had been gone for so long. And the message said simply that Earth was free and the skies were clear, and that the world was waiting for them to come home. And the cheer that rose from the troops shook the air, because it was not just victory, it was survival, and it meant everything. When the ships finally left the alien world and began the long journey home, the soldiers watched through the windows as the planet grew smaller behind them, and Ethan stood by the glass and thought of all that had been lost and all that had been saved, and he knew that even though the war was over, humanity had changed forever, and they were no longer just a small planet in a corner of the galaxy. They were something greater now, something that the stars themselves would have to remember. Back on Earth, the city still bore scars from the invasion, but the people were alive and rebuilding, and the lights of the new towers shone brighter than before, as if the world wanted to prove that it could never be broken. And the children played under the clear sky and learned about the war not as a story of pain, but as a story of courage, because that was how humans turned even their darkest hours into something worth remembering. Lara stood by the shore one evening, months later, watching the sun sink into the ocean, and she closed her eyes and thought of the faces of those who had fallen, and she whispered their names softly, because memory was the only monument that mattered. And Ethan came to stand beside her, and they said nothing for a while because there was nothing left to say, and yet everything was said in that silence. The stars came out one by one, and they looked up at them, and Ethan said quietly that maybe somewhere out there someone else was watching and wondering what kind of creatures humans really were. And Lara smiled a little and said that if they ever came looking for trouble again, they would find out the same way these invaders had. And Ethan nodded and said that was true, because humanity was many things, but never weak and never afraid. As the waves rolled in and the night deepened, the world seemed peaceful for the first time in years, and the war was now only a memory written in the stars and whispered by the wind and in the hearts of the people who had lived through it, because they had shown the universe a truth that could never be forgotten, that humanity might fight among itself and might fall and break and rise again, but if anyone tried to take their home or their freedom, they would learn too late what it truly meant to face humans. And somewhere far beyond the edge of known space, where the ruins of the alien empire floated silent and cold, a message drifted through the void, a warning written in the language of fire and loss, a story that every new civilization would one day hear, that when they declared war on Earth, no one had warned them what humans really were.